This video is sponsored by the Naval Institute Press, a division of the US Naval Institute. Watch until the end to discover how you can get 25 to 40% off their entire book collection. In 1938, this book was published, The Chosen Instrument by Captain Norman Macmillan, and in it you'll find a curious sentence. Navies and armies seek their opposite numbers, but the aeroplane is an enemy of the organized existence of the people. What does this have to do with Desert Storm, you might ask? Let me explain. Since the First World War, air power theorists have argued that air power would dislodge the centuries-old tradition of clashing armies. And it really doesn't matter whether it was Mitchell or Trenchard or Lapinski or Deaile. They all went against the conventional wisdom of the time. And for this, of course, we have to return to that famous, but quite frankly oversighted Clausewitzian saying of Der Krieg ist eine bloße Fortsetzung der Politik mit anderen Mitteln. By employing army against army, war across the centuries was one of sea and decisive land battles, all with the purpose to enforce upon the enemy your will from the outside. Well, here I have to apply an awkward translation from Clausewitz, to chip away until the enemy is thrown down and ultimately incapable of resisting. Airpower theorists saw in the aeroplane the means to turn this tradition on its head. The aeroplane, unchained from the two-dimensional battles of old, could bypass armies, put an end to action and reaction cycles, eliminate the fog of war, and shorten the time of the conflict. Think back to the statement of the time, the bomber will always get through, and what it implies. Taking the 5 rings model, this means that instead of acting against the enemy's army, the air-minded approach could act from the inside out, taking away the ability of the enemy to wage war in the first place by the destruction of the civil military leadership and means of production. Hence, the aeroplane as the enemy of the organized existence of the people. By shifting the center of gravity to disrupt this organization in its representation from production to the leadership, air power would be victorious, without having to battle an army. From the very beginning, air power thinkers believed that air power had unique capabilities. It also operated in a unique, separate and unobstructed realm. It would free civilian and military leaders from a no-choice reliance on land warfare. But to do this, the Aeromaniacs cautioned the air weapon had to be used strategically, independently and directly. Some theorists like Slessor, Mikotsi or Tukhachevsky of course saw air as army support, but the rationale of using air not to win battles, but to win wars became very deeply entrenched, especially in the West. The problem is, air power never won a war. We all think it did, because air power theorists and air forces after World War II told us that was the case. But careful inspection of cause and effect of strategic bombing during World War II, as well as sort of the air power that was used in Korea and in Vietnam, clearly shows that air power never won or lost a war. Where it could help to facilitate victory, victory was still down to the boots that were deployed on the ground. There is a case of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that ignores the fact that it was the nuclear weapon rather than the airplane itself that forced Japan to surrender. And the belief that air powers would win wars was not just a theory. It became a creed born out of the belief that the airplane epitomized technological superiority and as a carrier of nuclear bombs would bring about a swift victory, for example in a clash with the Soviet Union. And for this alone, it required an independent air force to achieve this victory. As historian Tami Biddle in her book Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare states, the United States Army Air Force's position as the nation's only nuclear-capable arm reinforced its propensity to pronounce the ultimate power of bombers. But atomic bombs were, in some sense, a parallel to the Royal Air Force's morale effect. They made it easier to avoid thinking through the still poorly understood relationship between bombing and enemy capitulation. USAF postulated a scenario that was attractive for purposes of deterrence and cost-cutting, but unrealistic in terms of the way states actually enter into and fight wars. These problems made themselves felt when American airmen found themselves fighting limited wars in Asia, where the theories underpinning Anglo-American strategic bombing had little relevance to the circumstances at hand. The Korean War, although seeing a US-led bomber offensive, was in fact a slog that reminded not of the battle over the Reich, but rather it resembled the Eastern Front or the hedgerows of Normandy. Well, take away the hedges and replace them with hills, mountains and valleys. USAF having placed nuclear deterrence as its raison d'etre, took few lessons from this. As Melvin Deaile writes in Always at War, despite the different nature of the Korean War, the SAC mentality remained unchanged. The Korean War became a limited war and soon became an air superiority fight. As interdiction of supplies to North Korean troops and close air support of US troops emerged as another priority, the fighter bomber took on a dominant role. To find out more about the USAF's nuclear mentality, check out this previous video I made. While you could suggest that air power had forced North Korea into an armistice, the belief that air alone would win a war finally came to an end with Vietnam. While much can be said, of course, about the micromanaging of air assets by the relevant governmental administrations that were actually involved in their planning, as well as the reluctance to fight a ground war, the Air Force, it was clear now, had to change, because the bomber and the bombing had failed, and the air weapon had not brought down Vietnam. As Richard Hallion actually puts forth in his essay, America as a Military Aerospace Nation. Vietnam revealed that the military services desperately needed institutional and cultural reform, and exposed critical weaknesses in command and control, from the national command authority down through theater level and further down to the operational and tactical level of war. Vietnam had one good result, an army officer remarked after the war. It made us question the way things are done. As with all my videos, I like to give reading recommendations, and as you know, my sources are always linked in the description below as well, so check those out. But if you're interested in today's topic, strongly consider getting yourself Airpower Reborn by John Olsen, the edited volume by John Olsen. In fact, it's the book that actually gave me sort of the impetus to make this video, because I found this sort of discussion about doctrine and the development of it quite interesting. And of course, I also know that many of you are interested sort of in the Army Air Force of World War II, how it developed, and the doctrinal aspects, also the technological aspects, of course. So consider for that getting Craig Morris, The Origins of American Strategic Bombing Theory, as well as Rise of the War Machines by Raymond O'Mara. Now, books are good, but you know what's even better? Getting them at 25% off. Yes, because today's sponsors, the US Naval Institute Press, will give you 25% off if you use my code. Yes, I know, a lot of YouTubers get mobile games or food subscription service or makeup as the sponsorships. For me, you'll get books and a 25% off. More information at the end of the video. Through Korea, the Bay of Pigs, and Vietnam, deficiencies in tactical air power had become so obvious, and the move to the ICBM as the means of nuclear deterrence diminished the role of the bomber. But the deployments in Asia had also resulted in another fundamental shift. The American air weapon, whether in the Air Force or in the US Navy, had become a global force, one that needed an expeditionary mindset, able to deploy rapidly with in-theater command and control, supported by flexible logistics, airlift capabilities, and in-air refueling. And at the same time, other conflicts like the Six-Day War in 1967 showed a totally different use of air power, one that achieved results. Faced with this, the Air Force had to re-examine the doctrinal underpinnings that it held so dear since the 1930s. What emerged was a changed force. Instead of the bomber, the multi-role fighter aircraft spearheaded not just the change in technology, but also the application of the air weapon. Electronic warfare systems and improved anti-radiation missiles started to counter the growing threat of radar and SAM. Advances in radar and missile technologies also pushed towards the control of the sky, as precision-guided and longer-range standoff weapons extended the destructive reach of aircraft, while the new F-14, F-15, F-16 and F-18 provided flexible platforms to deliver these. Meanwhile, stealth platforms like the F-117 and B-2 were to brave the missions no one else could fly. America moved from trusting in aviation firepower alone to embracing sudden, coordinated and overwhelming surgical strikes tied into a mobile air, airlift and naval force supported by intelligence, in-flight refueling, rapid decision-making, and above all, also high-fidelity training. Ironically, this, and not the bomber, would finally bring about the ability to act against insight and be effective. Bombers required clear and inflexible targets with proper planning and continuous attacks. But the flexible force that America now possessed was able to surgically and coordinatively chip away at an adversary's leadership, at its production, at its infrastructure, at its military processes, and the military force in itself. And no example shows this more clearly than Desert Storm. Desert Storm is sometimes referred to as a revolution in aerospace affairs. And while pictures like destroyed tanks, blown up vehicle columns, and stealth bombers might give reasons for such judgments, they are nothing but the result of the actual revolution. By utilizing technical advancements in ammunitions, including the eventual deployment of PGMs, a mixed force employed with clear target lists and dedicated kill boxes, as well as supported by a tanker bridge and aerial control systems such as AWACS and J-STARS, coalition forces were not just able to disrupt the Iraqi military, but its support infrastructure, its command and control, its morale, and while doing so, it reduced the fog of war, painting a picture of the battlefield through intelligence and surveillance. This, paired with overwhelming numerical air superiority, allowed the coalition's air forces to move from a more static preparatory air offensive to the mobile support during the ground offensive in a very fluid manner. As always, not everything went according to plan, but in some, the opening air campaign, followed by a coordinated ground offensive, allowed coalition forces to be victorious. As the final Gulf War Air Power Survey states, air power dominated the military outcome of Desert Storm. With the onset of the air campaign, coalition air forces embarked on their great effort to prepare the battlefield. By hampering Iraqi forces in the Kuwaiti theater of operations from the beginning of the war, coalition air power destroyed whatever willingness most might have had to fight the ground battle. It was the effectiveness of the air campaign in breaking apart the organizational structure and cohesion of enemy military forces and in reaching the mind of the Iraqi soldier that counted. Of course, while subsequent operations over Bosnia and Kosovo had led some to claim that air power had finally achieved that goal of ending wars, the outcomes of these conflicts are actually really more tied to the overall context of our operations as an extension, a military extension of political pressure. Air theory had matured. Over the years it had proven that it could extend the reach of the good old outside-in approach by targeting critical centers and eroding the resistance from the inside out. But while doing so, it also had to make the sober realization that it was air-land battles that brought victory, and that the old claim of the aeroplane bringing down the organized resistance of a people was an overambition, both in major and in limited wars. While recently the withdrawal from Afghanistan might not have been a high point for the West, it is noteworthy when looking at operations over Syria and comparing these to the present use of air power over Ukraine by Russia, how different US and by extension Western air power is. Noteworthy too is how little remains of the erstwhile truths that were held self-evident in the 1930s as we move into so-called fifth-generation platforms. As Alan Stevens in Fifth-Generation Strategy describes, fifth-generation strategic writing routinely uses such terms as tempo, the decision-making contest, knowledge dominance, strategic paralysis, the strategic raid, checkmate by operational maneuver, fleeting footprint, effect-based operations, the no-fly zone, and the rapid hold, none of which had any currency in first-generation concepts. Of course, that begs the question, while the air weapon has matured, what's going to happen now as we have unlocked space? Space, the final frontier. Okay, so space is still a long way off, but you know what's within our grasp? Knowledge. Yes, knowledge. It is. We just have to take it. And that's why I'm happy to say that I have, of course, partnered with the Naval Institute Press to give all of you 25% off their entire book catalog with my discount code. And you can, of course, find the links in the description below as well. Now, the United States Naval Institute Press, absolutely fantastic collection of books on aviation as well as on naval matters. And in fact, I could just... you know what, I don't need these talking points. I've been working with them for years, I've been using their books for years, even before I worked with them, and they're an absolutely fantastic publisher. They've got some really interesting stuff. So check that out with the description below, and if you are lost in the humongous catalog they have, I have my own reading list over there as well, where you get a little bit more of a tailored choice, especially things like air power. So check that out, and if you want, and 25% off discount isn't good enough, well, you can also join their membership program and that will give you a 40% discount. So get something for yourself, get something for somebody in your family, get something for a friend perhaps. And if you enjoy this sort of content, well, you can also consider checking out Patreon and channel memberships. You know how that goes. I don't have to give you the marketing spiel for that. And as always, also let me know what you thought about this episode. If you want to add something, if you want to discuss amongst yourself, the comment section is open. Just use it. And as always, I wish all of you a great day. Spend it with friends and family. Enjoy your day and see you in the sky.